This is What If I Told You, the event psychology video podcast for event professionals in which Victoria Mady, event consultant and host, talks with the world's top minds in behavioral science, neuroscience, and psychology on how to transform events using insights about human behavior and mind. For more science-based tips, join Event Psychology Club at eventpsychology.gumroad.com. Also, check out Victoria's online course, Event Psychology Lab, at eventpsychology.thinkific.com, which covers key behavioral science concepts and offers research-backed solutions to your event challenges. This course is a unique opportunity to upgrade your industry skills and gain a competitive edge without adding to your already busy schedule. Now, enjoy the conversation.
Hello, I'm Victoria Mady, and this is What If I Told You, the Event Psychology podcast, in which I talk all things event psychology. That's how to apply brain science insights in events. And this is the first podcast of 2023, and I'm very pleased to start this season with a topic that I find hugely helpful, not only for our jobs, but also as we go in our personal lives. I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Vanessa Bohns to the show. Vanessa, thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
Vanessa is a professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University, and she's the author of the book You Have More Influence Than You Think. She is an expert on help-seeking, social influence, compliance, consent, and why it's hard to say no. She holds a PhD in psychology from Columbia University and an AB from Brown University. Her research has been published in top academic journals in psychology, management, and law, and has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Economist, and NPR's Hidden Brain, among other media outlets. Vanessa, I recently started reading your book, and I feel like I stumbled on a gold mine because what you share is so helpful for personal development. And as I listen to your book, I can't help but think about someone who recently emailed me and thanked me for being a role model for them. And I remember clearly that at first I felt so happy. It was so nice to hear it. But at the same time, I got surprised because I kind of didn't expect that I would have such an impact on someone's life, at least not to such an extent that, as to be called a role model. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this, and I feel like this is one of the things that you cover in your book. And this is why I think it's a great resource to explore the topic of influence we have on others. So, and I mean, their influence on us as well. And my first question is, why do we underestimate the impact we have on other people?
I think a big part of it is that we tend to have this mental model of what influence is, kind of this idea of what it means to influence other people. And that mental model tends to be pretty narrow. It consists of these charismatic people who are standing on the stage and trying to influence people. It consists of the person who's standing across from someone with a different political opinion, and they're arguing with them, trying to get them to change their opinion. And we have this idea that that is influence. That's what influence looks like. And so if I'm having influence, I must be one of those people in that kind of position. And I'll know I'm influencing someone if I can tell that they suddenly, change their opinion, or I see everybody kind of nodding along, and it's really clear there's some tangible proof that I've influenced somebody else. And interestingly, we know from the science of influence that influence just doesn't happen like that, right? It's not that we suddenly change our minds when we're watching a particular speaker, or when we're having an argument. It often happens, weeks later, days later, years later, when we recall something somebody said to us. It happens inside our heads where another person can't necessarily see it, right? So we may be thinking and not quite convinced, or we may slowly be changing our minds, and you would have no idea if you were trying to, influence someone. It can even be that you convince someone to keep doing what they're already doing. And so there would be no tangible outcome, right? You could imagine having a conversation with a bunch of friends who have the same political opinion, right? And by having that conversation, you are influencing that group of friends to feel more strongly about what they already believed. So you don't necessarily see the impact that that had. And so because so much of influence is essentially invisible to us because it takes place in other people's heads and it takes place at times we may not be there, we tend to miss a lot of the influence we have, especially in these kind of subtle ways that aren't like I'm actively trying to influence you, but I just made a comment that you remembered weeks later.
But isn't it sort of, doesn't it mean that we have to be aware of a greater responsibility that we all have, not only, leaders or influencers, but ordinary people? Like everyone has this responsibility and should be aware of the magnitude of the influence that they have on other people.
Absolutely. And that was a main reason for writing the book. So as you mentioned, one hope was certainly to write a reassuring book that makes everybody recognize that they matter to other people, that, the things they say are not always, being ignored, that people actually do listen to them, that people actually do notice them. And that is very empowering. It gets us to ask for things that we should. It gets us to show up for causes we care about. But of course, there's the Spider-Man quote that with great power comes great responsibility. And the same thing is true for influence, right? So if a throwaway remark can actually reverberate in someone's head for, days or weeks or months later, that means that we should probably think twice before we say things. Not in a way that makes us insecure, where it's like, oh, how do I phrase this in the perfect way? But in a way where it's, maybe don't throw out some potential negative comment about another person, because other people will hear that. They, may take it to heart, and they may assume certain sorts of norms and expectations from that when you were just kind of throwing something out there without thinking.
Absolutely. Talking about invisibility, I got really amazed to read about the invisibility cloak illusion. Can you describe the experiment that revealed that phenomenon?
Yeah, so this is work by one of my colleagues named Erica Boothby and some of her co-authors. And she's done studies where she's essentially shown that people are paying more attention to us than we tend to realize. And she calls this the invisibility cloak illusion because essentially it describes the experience of walking through the world or interacting, in our daily lives, going about our daily lives and feeling like we're wearing an invisibility cloak, like no one's really noticing us. And the way that she studied this is in one study, she had people who were eating lunch. As they exited this place they were eating lunch, right, this big bustling cafeteria, she would give people surveys. And there were two things she wanted to know. She wanted to know, how much were you paying attention to the other people in the cafeteria, the people at your table, the people you were dining with, and strangers walking around? How curious were you about what they were thinking, just what was going on in their minds? And she also asked, how much do you think those people were paying attention to you? How curious do you think they were about your thoughts and what's going on in your mind? And what she found is a big disconnect between the extent to which we think that we notice other people and that they notice us. So we think that, we're super interested in other people, but that other people really aren't that interested in us. And one of the reasons for that is certain politeness norms that mean that if we catch eyes with someone, they'll do something called gaze aversion. So they avert their gaze, they look away, they make it look like they weren't really looking at you, right? And this is just a polite way of sort of interacting in public, but it means that we never really catch other people looking at us, paying attention to us, and we really don't know how much they're wondering about us. And so we tend to underestimate that.
How does it, what does it tell us about how we pay attention? Generally, how attention works?
I think, it tells us that we are really bad at understanding what other people pay attention to, right? And in particular, so a lot of the time I tell people this study and they get really paranoid, right? And so they think to themselves, of course, I knew everybody was paying attention to me, that time I had a really bad hair day, or that time I said that really stupid thing I was beating myself up about after that meeting, right? And so these times when we were acutely self-conscious, we think everyone was paying attention to me, right? And you just told me that that's true. But in fact, that's also an error. So we're also wrong when we think everyone's paying attention to us in those moments. And that's because there's another phenomenon called the spotlight effect, where when we're acutely nervous about something or self-conscious, we think everyone's paying attention to that thing. We think essentially the spotlight is shining on us, when that's not actually true. And you might say, you just said everyone's looking at you, and then you said no one's looking at you. And how do you reconcile those two things? Well, Erica Boothby has done this in some of her studies, and she has one study where she brought people into the lab, and she either had them just wear their ordinary clothes that they were wearing for the day, or she had them put on this embarrassing t-shirt that they would be really self-conscious to be caught wearing. And she asked them, how much do you think these other people in the study who they were asked to interact with noticed what you were wearing? And it turns out when people were wearing their ordinary clothes that they wouldn't have any reason to really be thinking about, they weren't that self-conscious about, they underestimated how much other people had noticed what they were wearing. We're sort of paying attention to them. If they were given this really embarrassing t-shirt, they overestimated how much other people were paying attention to them. So they thought everyone was noticing this embarrassing t-shirt, when in fact that also was not true.
This is a great experiment. I really enjoyed reading about, the study and the results of that experiment. There is a section in your book where you describe how other people's presence impacts one's own experience, and how sharing experiences with others changes one's own experience. And I kind of find that really relevant when it comes to events, because that's about sharing experiences. And I wonder if you have any insights on this, or if you can elaborate on this topic, and also in relation to events.
Yeah, so this finding is essentially that shared experiences you share in the same space and at the same time with other people, tend to be amplified. So they tend to be intensified. This has been shown for things like eating chocolate. So researchers have had two people either eat chocolate together or alone. And even without communicating, without looking at one another, with no kind of interaction, simply being present with another person makes sweet chocolate taste sweeter. But interestingly, it also makes bitter chocolate taste more bitter. And so it just intensifies whatever the experience is. So a pleasant experience becomes more pleasant, and an unpleasant experience becomes more unpleasant. And some other researchers have shown this with things like looking at art as well. So you could be looking at a piece of art and you have a certain reaction to it. And if you're looking at it standing next to another person, that reaction tends to be amplified. And the explanation for these effects is that we do something called mentalization. So we're experiencing something, we're looking at this piece of art, we're eating this chocolate, and we're thinking about our own experience. But if we know someone else is doing it at the same time as us, we also are imagining what they're thinking about that thing. And so it essentially doubles our experience, right? We experience it through our own minds and then also through this other person's mind. And so I was thinking about this, because I know this is a podcast for event professionals, and I think it has a lot to say about events. And it, of course, has something to say about virtual versus in person, right? And we have some other research as well suggesting that in person is actually a fundamentally different experience. I mean, there's just no way around it, right? It gives people a certain experience that they crave, and it allows for all sorts of interactions that you can't have over even, a Zoom platform or a video platform. But I do think it also has something to say about how to make those kind of video platforms better if you were to still have to do a virtual conference or a hybrid conference or something like that. And that's because a shared experience has two components. So one is shared space, right? You get everybody into the same room and they're like watching a presentation. And so that is an actual real difference that scientists have shown, that when we're in the same physical space as other people, it is different. There's just some sort of evolutionary difference when we're around other people, right? But there's also another component of shared experiences, and that's a shared temporal experience. So we're doing something at the same time. And as long as you're watching something and other people are watching it at the same time as you, it gives you that chance to still engage in mentalization. Like, everyone's watching this, I wonder what they're thinking about this thing. And so you could still get that sort of intensified experience just by having more events be live as part of a conference, right? Finding ways where people are still interacting in real time, even if they can't be in the same shared space.
Mm-hmm. This is a great insight, and I really love that you touch upon the differences between virtual experiences and in-person experience, because there are so many debates, especially at the start of the pandemic, when the whole industry pivoted to virtual, and people were discussing is it bad or is it good? And of course, there are pros and cons, as with anything else, right? But what you are talking about is a very interesting and helpful insight to add to that debate and actually figure out how to do it while we are actually combining virtual and in person. And I think going forward, we will have more and more hybrid event experiences. So it's really helpful to understand how it works from the social psychology perspective. What I also wanted to ask you is the power that the audience has. And I was really interested to learn more about that from your book. And because I've never thought about that from that angle, when imagining that, I'm speaking at events, for example, and you usually imagine that all the power belongs to the expert or to the speaker. Even when we have formats where we have more interaction, still, there is such a belief maybe that the audience doesn't have that much power. But you say, the opposite, and you provide a lot of evidence for that. Can you elaborate on this particular topic? And also, is there a way to make sure that the audience understands its power?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, that we tend to kind of, again, because of this mental model we have of influence, we think that the person with all the power is the person with the microphone, the person standing at the podium, the person leading the discussion, right? But as someone who has given a lot of talks and who teaches a 300-person class, I can tell you that person in the front of the room is vigilantly monitoring the audience, right? As you're speaking, you are looking to the audience to get some sort of sense of whether they agree with you, whether they're following you, whether they're nodding off. And you pay a lot of attention to the facial expressions you're getting, to any questions that you're being asked. And I think even, having given talks and taught big classes, sitting in the audience, it's easy to feel invisible, to forget that person in the front of the stage can actually see you, like you're not invisible. Yes. And you can feel like you're just kind of listening as opposed to contributing. But in fact, that person at the front of the stage, right, as they're monitoring the audience's reaction, they're tuning their message to the audience. They are changing how they're talking about something. If people seem like they're really engaged in it, maybe, I'll talk about it a little bit more. If my students clearly seem like their faces are glazed over and I'm talking about one topic, I'll try to change it up, right? And depending on the audience you're talking to, you may even change the way you talk about a particular issue. And audiences often don't realize how much that can actually change your attitude about a particular position. So, if I go in and I'm talking about something to one demographic group, right, and I talk about it in a certain way and everybody nods along and it seems like they really agree with that, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, hey, I started out just trying to sort of pitch this idea to this group so that they would enjoy it. But actually, these were some good ideas I came up with. And now simply having spoken to an audience, right, not even an audience trying to influence me, but just speaking to an audience, tuning my message to that audience has made me sort of convinced of what I imagine the audience's perspective to be. And so there is a lot of power in the audience. And I think, as I said, it's easy to feel invisible when you're in the audience and feel like you don't have that power. And I think speakers who do a really good job of showing the audience that they are, in fact, really involved and part of sort of this interactive, even if they're not talking, part of this interactive context, right? They will engage with the audience. They'll point things out. If we're all looking at people's faces, but a really great speaker can sort of point out, oh, you seem skeptical or you seem like this. And all of a sudden the audience is like, oh, wow, that speaker can really see me. Right. And it kind of it shows everyone that this is an interactive situation, even if it appears on the outside to be just me speaking at you.
This is great. This is a great idea because I've never thought about it this way, that even though it might feel interactive, even though it is not interactive in nature in a way that they're doing something, right? They might be feeling this interaction if the speaker shows that they recognize their reactions, the audience's reactions, and the audience's feelings, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. And my next question is this. So a lot of insights that you share in the book, I find that they are great for improving networking at events. And I particularly like the one study that about interaction with a stranger and how it has a bigger impact than we think. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there's some work on something called the liking gap, where when we interact with a stranger, we tend to think, after the interaction, we kind of go through it in our heads and we can think of all the things we feel like we did wrong, right? Like I talked too much, I didn't ask enough questions, I said that stupid thing. And we think that the other person is kind of assessing us kind of negatively because of all that. But in fact, they're doing the same thing to themselves, right? And they're just kind of remembering the things we said on this more sort of broad stroke way, not this, oh, I can't believe they said this specific thing. They're just walking away with a general sense of that, that was a nice conversation. They're not kind of going over everything you said. They're going over everything they said. And so because of that, researchers have found that if you ask two people when they leave a conversation, just a simple interaction between strangers, how much they think the other person liked them, both people tend to underestimate how much the other person likes them. So we both walk away being like, that was really nice, but I feel like that other person didn't like me, right? And so that can make networking much more comfortable. I think just knowing that we're biased and all these things that we're kind of beating ourselves up about after we talk to someone, the other person likely didn't even notice. Another finding that some researchers have recently shown is that when you interact with a stranger, again, in these kind of, networky types of interactions, when we guess how much that person is thinking about us and that conversation after the fact, we tend to underestimate that as well. And so not only do people have a more positive view of the conversation they just had, they remember it for longer and think about it for longer than we think that they are. And so, a lot of us will hold back in networking. Is it really worth it? Does it really accomplish anything? But in fact, it probably has a bigger effect and a more positive effect than many of us, give it credit for.
These are great, pieces of advice for networking or for networking guidelines for attendees, Because if we can let people know that a lot of their beliefs about networking and communication are false, and actually they have, again, more influence, and they can get more out of networking because it's more pleasant for the other side than they think, that may hugely improve the networking experience, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and my other question is about burnout. I want to talk about it because it's a huge issue for event professionals in particularly, and you say that a lot. You talk a lot about burnout in your book, and I agree that burnout is partly caused by inability to say no on the one hand, and some certain beliefs about how we ask for help on the other hand. So can you talk about studies and insights on these two sides of the coin? And are there some strategies that we can use to fight burnout?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, there are a couple different sides to burnout. So one is there's the person who's actually burning out, right? Who maybe needs a little break and could ask someone for help to get that break. But many of us will bend over backwards to avoid asking someone, even for a small favor that just might give us, a small sort of break. So just feel like we got something taken off our plate. When in fact, I have research showing that we underestimate how likely people are to do things for us if we were to just ask them for a small favor, and how negatively they would assess us for asking for that favor. So at this point, my colleagues and I, we've run participants in studies where we've had them ask over 15,000 people for little favors. So it could be something like, will you just fill out the survey? Will you donate to this charity that I'm raising money for? All sorts of different favors. And we have them guess how likely people are to agree. And they go out and then ask people, and they find again and again that people are about twice as likely to agree as they expect. Another colleague of mine, Allison Wood Brooks, has research showing that we also think that people will judge us more negatively if we ask for things. So she has people ask for advice. And we tend to think that, if we ask someone for advice, they're going to judge us negatively. They're going to think, we couldn't solve this problem ourselves. But in fact, they judge us pretty positively because we're being proactive, and they feel flattered that we came to them. Like, that's actually an indicator that they really respect us, right? And so a lot of times we hesitate to ask for help in ways that might help us alleviate some of the burden we have that could be contributing to burnout, because we have these misperceptions about asking for help, that it's going to make us look bad, that people don't really want to help us, that, we're likely to be rejected. But there's also the other side. And so one thing I always like to point out is that there's so many tips for the person burning out, to take time to put away email, to ask for help. And we don't as often give advice to everybody else who's contributing to a culture that contributes to burnout. And so one thing my colleagues and I have looked at is people sending emails at all hours of the day, right? At night, on the weekend. And we find that when we send those emails, we kind of think, this person will get to it whenever they want to, right? There's no rush on my end sending it. I'm just trying to get it off my plate. But the person on the other side doesn't feel like that, right? Many of us have our phones right next to our bed. We hear the little ding, we feel like, I just want to respond to this now. And there's very simple things we can do. We can delay our emails to come in on Monday, right? Or during the workday. So that's one way. Another strategy that my colleague Laura Gearge and I have tested is telling the other person that our email is not urgent, making it really clear. Many of us don't actually put a date or a deadline in our emails unless there's an urgent deadline and we want something done really quickly. We don't tell people when we don't need something done really quickly. And so they don't realize when they have time, when they could just wait until Monday or the next day to get back to us. And so making it explicit when you don't have an urgent need for a response is also a way to sort of help mitigate burnout for everybody, right? And not just put the onus on the person who is feeling burnt out to, not check their email at night.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Those are great suggestions, actually. And I really like the last one because it feels like it should be understandable or obvious to everyone, right? If I receive an email and there is no deadline in the email, then I should assume it's not urgent, but it's not that, right? It's kind of, I immediately assume that person is expecting my answer, and that kind of becomes a burden for me. And I feel compelled to answer as soon as possible, right? But just making it clear, just adding this line that it's not urgent takes this burden off for both sides, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah, this is a great suggestion. Right. And I've got a couple of final questions for you. The first one is, what would you say is the single one science insight that event professionals should apply immediately?
So I was thinking about this one, and I'll say we have a finding where we have people give compliments to strangers and we have them predict how good it's going to make the person feel. And then we actually survey the people, and it turns out that complimenting someone makes the other person feel so much better than we expect. We think it's going to be so much more awkward than it actually is. The other person doesn't feel awkward usually much at all, but we feel like it's really awkward to go up to someone. And so I've done these workshops where I just have people write a compliment on a note and give it to the person next to them. Just think of something you genuinely like about another person and just, write it down and hand it to them. And it seems so formal and forced, and you would think it doesn't work, but it works. Even though they were just instructed to give this compliment, the other person, people put time into it and effort, and they write something really nice, and the other person really feels great. And everyone walks away kind of feeling like, oh, it felt good to give a compliment. It felt good to get a compliment. So I would say coming up with ways to encourage that in events could be a really fun sort of intervention. Even if you had little compliment cards or, a note about if you see someone doing something nice, if you liked someone's presentation, if you thought someone's comment was really astute, go up and share it. It's going to mean more to them than you think. And I think that could just lead to a general sort of more positive vibe in an event.
Mm-hmm. This is an excellent suggestion. Thank you so much. I guess, it makes it also a very interesting and positive activity, like an interaction during an event experience. So if I'm profs, take note, please. And my final question is like a signature question. The podcast title is What If I Told You? Can you complete this sentence with one takeaway relevant to our conversation?
Yeah, I'd say to sort of sum it all up, I'd say, what if I told you that you matter more than you realize? Because at the end of the day, it's really about like you matter in other people's lives. They notice you more than you realize. They think about the things you say more than you realize. They'll do things for you more than you realize that they would if you were to ask them. And at the end of the day, you just matter more in people's lives than we tend to know.
Thank you. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Vanessa. That was an excellent conversation and lots of insights that we can apply in events. And I invite everyone to connect with Vanessa on LinkedIn and Twitter, and of course, get her book. Thank you for tuning in to What If I Told You, the Event Psychology podcast. For more brain science insights and for this episode recap, I invite you to join the Event Psychology Club. And also, if you want to upgrade your skills and get research-based solutions for your events, I invite you to take the Event Psychology Lab online course that I created for event profs like you. Until next time, bye-bye.